The sky above Kalos IV was orange most mornings. Not a pretty orange. It was the kind of orange that came from iron dust in the air, kicked up by the mining machines that never stopped running. The people who lived there had learned to love it anyway. They had learned to love a lot of things about that hard, dry world. The rumble of the earth movers before dawn, the smell of hot metal and rock, being the ultra-plead. In the dust between the worker barracks, like it, was the finest sand on any beach. 80,000 people called Kalos IV home. They were miners, mostly. Workers who had signed contracts to dig rare minerals from the deep crust of the planet. But there were also teachers, doctors, cooks, engineers, and families, whole families, who had built something real on that orange, skied rock. There were schools, there were markets, there were little gardens behind the housing blocks, where people grew things that had no business, growing on an alien world, but grew anyway because the people tending them refused to give up. Nobody expected what came next. Nobody had any reason to. The Vreth fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at 6:14 in the morning, colony time. There were 42 warships. They did not send a message. They did not announce themselves. They simply appeared in orbit like a storm that had been hiding just past the horizon, and then they began. The first strikes hit the communication towers. That was always how it started with the Vreth. Cut the voice first, so no one can call for help. The towers were gone in under a minute. Then the orbital defense platforms, were small and old and never meant for a fight like this, were destroyed in the next 4 minutes. After that, the Vreth turned their weapons on the ground. They were not trying to capture the colony. They were not trying to occupy it. They were not demanding surrender. What Fleet Admiral Sayan Vorath had ordered from the bridge of his command ship high above the planet was simple and total. He had ordered the colony erased. Vorath was a tall creature, even by Vreth standards. His scales were dark green along his back and pale yellow on his throat. He had fought in 11 campaigns across his long career. He had conquered worlds that had resisted for years. He was not a being who felt much of anything when he looked down at an enemy. The people on Kalos IV were not really an enemy in his mind. They were barely a consideration. Humans to Vorath were a nuisance species. They spread too fast, took up too much space, and had too high an opinion of themselves for beings who had only just reached the stars. The massacre was not personal. That was the worst part of it. It was not personal at all. It was a message, delivered to a species that Vorath believed would not survive long enough to read it properly. Down on the surface, there was chaos. People ran. Parents grabbed children. Workers abandoned their machines and ran for the emergency shelters built into the rock. Some shelters filled within minutes. Some never opened because the entrances had already been buried under rubble from the first strikes. Power grid failed across the northern settlement in the second wave of bombing. In the darkness and the fire and the screaming, it was impossible to know where to go or what to do. A 12-year-old girl named Mira Osi was in the school building when the first explosion shook the walls. She had been early to class that morning because she had wanted to finish a drawing she had started the day before. A drawing of her mother standing in their garden holding tomatoes she had grown from seeds, brought all the way from Firth. The drawing fell to the floor when the ceiling cracked. Mira did not pick it up. Her teacher, Mr. Dohi, grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back hallway, shouting for the other children to follow. Mr. Dohi had read the emergency protocols. He knew where the access tunnels were. The old mining shafts under the school that connected to the deep maintenance passages beneath the colony. He got 14 children into that tunnel before the school building came down behind them. They ran in the dark, following the faint emergency lights along the tunnel walls. Mira had her school bag on her back. Inside it was her lunch, a spare sweater, a small data tablet she used for homework, and a comm recorder she had borrowed from her father the week before to record a class presentation. She did not know that the comm recorder was still running. She did not know that it had turned on automatically when the first shockwave hit, triggered by the noise. It recorded everything, the running feet, the children crying, the sound of the world above them being destroyed, a deep and terrible rumbling that never quite stopped. The tunnels went deep. That was what saved them. In the hours that followed, the Vreth completed their work. They were thorough. Every settlement block, every vehicle, every power source on the surface was destroyed or burned. Ground troops landed in the third hour and moved through the ruins, checking for life. They were not checking to help survivors. They were checking to ensure there were none. Most of the people who had not made it underground did not survive. Vorath watched the reports come in from his bridge. His officers were calm and professional. They spoke in clipped, formal language about percentage completion and thermal confirmation of targets. Not one of them said the word killed. They said cleared. They said neutralized. They used the language of machinery because it was easier that way, easier to speak of humans as things rather than people, easier to do what they were doing without looking at it too directly. When the final report reached him, Vorath read it twice. Then he nodded and ordered the record sealed and transmitted to the Vreth High Council as a demonstration of the Dominion's reach. 80,114 confirmed dead. He then ordered a secondary transmission sent, not to the Council, broadcast openly across the galactic communication network, where any civilization with a receiver could pick it up. It contained the coordinates of Kalos IV, the timestamp of the attack, the name of the fleet, and his name, signed at the bottom. He wanted humans to know who had done this. He wanted every other species watching to know that the Vreth Dominion could do this, to anyone, whenever they chose. Then Vorath ordered his fleet pointed toward Earth, not to attack, not yet, but as a gesture. He sat in his command chair and looked at the stars in the direction of the human homeworld, and he felt something close to amusement. Let them grieve, he thought. Let them understand what they are. Deep in the tunnels beneath the ruin of Kalos IV, Mira Osi sat with her back against a cold stone wall and held a little boy named Pip, who was 6 years old and would not stop shaking. There were 183 survivors in the tunnel network by the end of the first day. They had found each other in the dark, drawn together by voices and the thin beam of lights from comm devices and work lamps. They were injured, terrified, and had no way to call for help. Communications were gone. The surface was gone. Mira did not cry that first night. She wanted to. She thought about her mother and her father. And she did not know where they were, and she was so scared that the fear felt like something physical, a hand pressing on her chest. But Pip was shaking, and so she held him, and she made herself breathe slowly, in and out, so that he could feel her breathing, and maybe slow down his own. She did not know her recorder was still running. She did not know that it had captured everything. The explosions, the sounds of the destruction above, the voices of children in the dark, and now this, the quiet after, which was somehow worse than the noise had been. On the third day, a ship came. It was unmarked. It had no colony markings, no rescue service colors, no flag. It was matte black and moved without lights and set down in the open ruins of the colony's main landing pad with a precision that suggested a very skilled or very determined pilot. Hatches opened. People came out in environment suits and moved quickly and quietly through the rubble, scanning, calling out in low voices. They found the tunnel entrance. They got everyone out. The survivors were brought onto the ship in silence. There were people on board already, adults who did not explain who they were or what the ship was. They gave the survivors water and food and medical care. They wrapped blankets around the children. Them gently took Mira's school bag to check it. And when they found the comm recorder still running, still recording, they looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then they brought it to a room at the back of the ship where a woman sat at a console, watching screens. The woman had short gray hair and calm eyes. She took the recorder and pressed play, and she listened. She listened to all of it. Every minute that the recorder had captured. From the first explosion to the sound of children breathing in the dark. When it finished, she sat still for a moment. Then she set the recorder down carefully, like it was something fragile. She opened a channel to the ship's bridge and said 4 words in a quiet, flat voice. Begin the return journey. No one on that ship sent any message. No transmission went out to any alien civilization. No broadcast was made. The ship simply rose from the ruins of Kalos IV and turned silently toward home. Behind them, the orange sky over the dead colony slowly filled with ash. And across the galaxy, the Vreth Dominion waited for humanity to respond. They were still waiting. Earth said nothing at all. The news of Kalos IV spread across the galaxy the way bad news always does. Fast, without mercy. With 48 hours of the Vreth broadcast, every major civilization with a long-range communication receiver had seen the mission. The coordinates, the timestamp, the name of the fleet, the name of Vorath, signed at the bottom like it was something to be proud of. The Quarry Collective received it first, passed it to the Mendari Confederation, who passed it to the Selari Hegemony, and by the end of the first week there was not a single council chamber or diplomatic hall in the known galaxy where the name Kalas IV had not been spoken at least once. Most civilizations said the right things. They issued formal statements of condolence. They called the attack troubling. They used careful diplomatic words that meant very little. The Mendari Confederation sent a message to the nearest human trade station expressing deep sorrow for the loss of life. The Selari Hegemony, who had never been particularly warm toward humanity, said nothing official but quietly passed word through back channels that they did not endorse what the Vreth had done. A handful of smaller species sent flowers, actual flowers, in pressurized containers, to the human embassy on the neutral station of Vale Point. Nobody did anything else. Nobody wanted to make an enemy of the Vreth Dominion over a dead human colony. That was the simple truth that sat underneath all the polite words. The Vreth were powerful, well-armed, and had demonstrated very clearly what they were willing to do. Most civilizations had their own worlds to protect, their own people to think about, and humans, while they had been expanding quietly through the outer reaches of space for the past century, were still considered a young species, a minor power, not worth going to war over. The galaxy watched and waited for humanity to respond. The response never came. 1 week passed. Then 2. Human shipping lanes, which had previously seen steady traffic of cargo vessels and exploration ships moving in and out of contested space, went quiet. Human ambassadors, who had maintained a regular presence at the Vale Point summit meetings, stopped appearing. Messages sent to Earth's official diplomatic channels were received. The delivery confirmations came back, but no replies followed. The human embassy on Vale Point remained open and staffed, but the ambassador inside it sat behind a closed door and spoke to no one. It was, by any measure, deeply strange. Ambassador Tail of the Quarry Collective was the first to say so out loud. Tail was an older diplomat, thin and pale-skinned in the way of his species, with large dark eyes that had a habit of going very still when he was thinking hard. He had spent 30 years in the diplomatic service and had dealt with hundreds of species in crisis. He had seen species respond to attacks with rage, with grief, with political chaos, with desperate negotiation. He had never seen a species respond with nothing, with complete, unbroken silence. He sat in his office on Vale Point 3 weeks after the massacre and pulled up every piece of historical data his archive contained on human behavior. He read for a long time. He read about human wars, human responses to disaster, human patterns of conflict. He found that humans had a long and complicated history of fighting back when attacked. They had never, in any recorded case, simply done nothing, which meant they were not doing nothing. He found a line in a very old human text, a collection of military writings from Earth's early history, and he read it twice, then a third time it said, "Beware the man who has stopped arguing. He is no longer trying to change your mind. He has already decided what comes next." Tail sat with that line for a long time. Then he tried to contact the human ambassador on Vale Point directly, private channel, without going through official protocols. He sent a simple message. He said he was concerned, and that he wanted to talk. He considered himself a friend to humanity. The message was received. No reply came. He tried again 4 days later. Same result. Tail began making inquiries among his network of contacts. He was careful. He did not want to appear to be prying into human affairs at a sensitive time. But he had friends, traders, scientists, neutral station operators, who traveled near human space, and he reached out to them quietly. What he heard back was small things, individual pieces that did not seem like much on their own. A merchant captain who regularly ran cargo between the outer belt stations and a human supply depot reported that the depot had been closed without notice. When he approached the station to ask about rescheduling, a human vessel, unmarked, no registry he could find, had come alongside his ship, and a voice on the comm had politely told him that the station was temporarily unavailable and that he should redirect his route. The voice had been pleasant, calm. It had offered him coordinates for an alternative supply point, wished him safe travels, and ended the call. The captain told Tail that the thing that stayed with him was not what the voice said, but how it sounded. He had been in deep space for 20 years and had spoken to humans many times. They were usually talkative, expressive people. The voice on the comm had been like speaking to still water. Completely flat, completely controlled. Another contact, a scientist who operated a research station near the edge of the Jupiter system's sensor range, reported something different. She said she had picked up strange energy readings from the direction of Jupiter's moons. Large readings. The kind that came from significant construction activity or significant power output. She had tried to get a clearer look with her long-range sensors. Before she could properly focus them, a human vessel had appeared beside her station without any prior signal or warning, just appeared, as if it had been sitting quietly nearby all along, and a crew member had come aboard and asked to speak with her. The crew member was young, a woman in a plain gray uniform with no markings on it. She had been polite. She had explained that the area near Jupiter was currently restricted for safety reasons. Nothing to worry about, and that it would be appreciated if the scientist could redirect her sensors away from that region for a while. She had been offered compensation for the inconvenience. She had accepted. The crew member had thanked her and left. The scientist told Tail that when she asked the woman what was being built out there, the woman had smiled. A small, quiet smile, and said nothing. Tail compiled all of this. He sat with it in the dark of his office one night and looked at it from every angle. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had spent his career navigating the most dangerous political situations in the galaxy. Something about the picture forming in front of him made him feel cold, in a way he was not used to. He sent one more message to the human ambassador. This time he did not ask for a conversation. He wrote only one sentence. He wrote, "I know you are not grieving. I know you are preparing. Please tell me there is still a way to stop this." The message was received. That night, first time in weeks, a reply came back from the human embassy. It was 4 words, it said. "There is not one." Tail read those 4 words and sat very still for a long time. Then he got up and went to his window and looked out at the stars. The way they always hung there, so permanent and calm. And he thought about the 80,000 names on that dead colony world. And he thought about the human voice that had told a merchant captain to turn his ship around. And he thought about the young woman in the gray uniform with no markings on it. And he felt, for the first time in his long career, genuinely afraid. Not afraid of the Vreth. Afraid of what was coming for the Vreth. Back on his command ship, in a comfortable chair in a warm room, Fleet Admiral Sayan Vorath was reading the same reports his intelligence officers had compiled about human silence. He read them, with the mild curiosity of a being who had already won, and was simply watching the aftermath settle. One of his officers flagged the energy readings near Jupiter, the sensor anomaly, the closed shipping lanes. Vorath looked at each item and found nothing alarming in any of it. Species collapsed in different ways after a catastrophic loss. Humans were probably in political chaos. Probably arguing among themselves about what to do. Probably paralyzed with shock. He told his officer to log the Jupiter readings as a probable sensor error and move on. He ordered a celebratory dinner for his senior staff that evening. They ate well. They talked and laughed. Someone made a joke about humans, and everyone at the table laughed louder than the joke deserved. The way people do when they are very comfortable and believe themselves to be completely safe. Outside, in the cold dark between the stars, something was moving. It was not making any noise. It was not sending any signals. It was just moving, steady and quiet, in the direction of Vreth space. And it had been moving for weeks. Not everything humanity built was visible. That was the thing most species got wrong when they thought about humans. They looked at the human trade stations, the colony worlds, the small diplomatic offices on neutral ground, and they made their calculations based on what they could see. They counted the ships that showed up at summits. They measured the weapons on the vessels that traveled public routes. They watched the humans who sat at negotiating tables and spoke carefully and smiled and offered compromises, and they thought they understood what humanity was. They were looking at the front of the house. They never thought to check what was underneath it. 31 years before the massacre on Kalos IV, a small group of people sat in a room deep inside a mountain on Earth and made a decision. They were not politicians. They were not famous. Most of their names would never appear in any public record. They were military strategists, Engineers, scientists, and a single historian who had spent her career studying every war humanity had ever fought and every war it had nearly lost. They sat in that room for 3 days, and they asked each other a question that no one in the government wanted to ask out loud. The question was this: what happens if someone out there decides to simply kill us, not defeat us, not conquer us, not demand our resources or our submission, just kill us, the way you step on something small that is in your way? What happens then? They spent 3 days answering that question. When they were done, they had a plan. They called it Stillwater. They buried it in a classified budget line that no foreign government and very few human officials would ever see, and they began to build. They built quietly. They built slowly. They built in places no one was looking. In the deep shadow of Jupiter's moons, in the asteroid fields beyond the edge of surveyed space, in underground facilities on worlds that were listed in public records as geological survey sites. They built over decades, passing the work from one generation of engineers to the next, improving and expanding and waiting with the patience of people who hoped they would never need to use what they were creating, but understood that hope was not a strategy. Stillwater had one trigger, one single condition that would activate it automatically, without requiring a vote or a debate or a diplomatic process. That condition was a confirmed, unprovoked mass killing of human civilians on a scale that could not be called anything other than a massacre. The number they had settled on, after long argument, was 50,000. If 50,000 or more human civilians were killed in a deliberate attack, Stillwater activated, not after a committee reviewed it, not after the government debated it, automatically, because the people who built it understood that grief and politics together produced delay, and delay in those circumstances was a death sentence. 80,000 people died on Kalos IV. Stillwater activated 6 minutes after the final casualty count was confirmed. The woman who commanded it was Admiral Yusra Kane. She was 63 years old and had spent the last 11 years running Stillwater from a command facility so far below the surface of Titan that the weight of the moon above her was measurable. She was a small woman with short gray hair and a habit of speaking very softly, so that the people around her had to lean in to hear her. She had found over many years that people paid more attention to quiet voices than to loud ones. When Stillwater activated, she was sitting at her desk reading a geology report that had nothing to do with geology. Her console chimed once. She looked at the alert. She read it. She set down the report. She pressed a single button that sent a coded pulse to every Stillwater facility, shipyard, command node across the solar system. The pulse meant it is time. What followed was not chaos. It was not emotional. It was the most organized thing humanity had ever done, and it looked, to the handful of people who knew it was happening, like watching a very large and very precise machine come to life after a long, cold sleep. The shipyards on Ganymede, which had been listed in public records as inactive mineral processing facilities, opened their external bays for the first time in years. The ships inside them were not mineral processors. They were warships, and they had been maintained in perfect condition by skeleton crews who rotated in and out on classified contracts, people who had signed agreements so thorough that they had never told their families what they actually did for work. The ships powered up one by one, and their crews, who had been living ordinary lives on Earth and the colonies, keeping themselves ready, began reporting to departure points. There were 4,312 warships in the Stillwater fleet. Most species in the galaxy had no idea humanity owned that many. Most humans had no idea either. The weapons on these ships were not the standard armaments that appeared on human vessels at diplomatic summits. Over 30 years, the engineers of Stillwater had pursued a specific line of weapons research that had been deliberately kept out of every public and semi-public defense program. They had studied the physics of collapsed stars, the way matter behaved under pressures that existed nowhere else in nature, and they had built weapons based on what they found there. Weapons that did not simply destroy things but unmade them, at a level so fundamental that there was very little left to examine afterward. They had also built something called the Quietus. Quietus was an artificial intelligence, though calling it that felt insufficient. It had been designed with one purpose: to coordinate a military campaign of the kind no human commander could manage alone, across multiple star systems, against a target whose full defensive layout was not completely known. run 40,000 simultaneous tactical calculations. It could adjust a campaign plan in real time as new information came in. It did not feel fear or doubt or hesitation. It simply solved the problem in front of it with whatever tools were available. Admiral Kane had worked with the Quietus for 9 years. She trusted it the way she trusted mathematics, not because it was warm, because it was reliable. In the first week after activation, the Quietus processed every piece of intelligence humanity had ever gathered on the Dominion. It mapped their shipyards, their supply lines, their command structures, their patrol routes, their communication networks. It identified every military asset in Vreth space and calculated the most efficient sequence for removing each one. It built a campaign plan that ran to 11,000 pages of operational detail, and it presented that plan to Admiral Kane in a summary that took 4 minutes to read. She read it. She asked 3 questions. Quietus answered them. She approved the plan. There was one part of the plan she had added herself. For the Quietus was given the final parameters. It was a rule. A hard limit written into the operational code so that nothing could override it without her direct authorization. The rule was this: civilian infrastructure was not to be targeted under any circumstances. Homes, hospitals, production, water systems, none of it was to be touched. Only military targets. Only the people and systems that had made the massacre possible, or would make future ones possible. When one of her officers had asked why show restraint when the Vreth had shown none? Kane had looked at him for a moment before answering. She said, "We are not doing this because we are like them. We are doing this because we are nothing like them." The officer did not ask again. Mira OC was brought to a facility on Earth that she was not told the name of. She was given a room and food and medical care for the injuries she had sustained in the tunnels. People came and sat with her, not to question her, but just to be there, in the way adults sometimes sit with children who have seen too much. Because being alone with it is the worst part. After 2 weeks, when she was a little steadier, a woman came to speak with her. The woman had short gray hair and calm eyes, and introduced herself simply as Yusra. She did not explain who she was or what her rank was. She sat across from Mira, and she asked her how she was doing, and she listened to the answer, without rushing it. Then, gently, she asked Mira about the recorder. She asked if she could listen to it. Mira said yes. Angels listened to the entire recording from beginning to end without speaking. When it finished, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she thanked Mira, and she stood to leave. At the door, Mira asked her a question. She asked, "Are you going to do something?" Kane stopped. She looked back at the girl. The girl was 12 years old and had survived the end of her world by running through the dark and holding a younger child so he would not be as afraid. Kane said yes. Mira looked at her and said good. Outside the facility on the dark side of Titan, 4,000 ships were moving into formation. They carried no flags. They sent no signals. They made no announcements. They simply formed up in the cold and the quiet, and they waited for the order. And when the order came, they moved. They moved toward Vreth space. They did not hurry. They did not need to. They had already decided, and when humans decided, they did not stop. The first thing the Vreth border outpost on Harith Station saw was a shadow. Not a ship, not a fleet. Just a shadow. A darkness moving across the stars that did not belong there. The way a cloud moves across a clear sky, except there are no clouds in space and there is no reason for stars to disappear and reappear unless something very large is passing in front of them. The sensor operator on duty stared at his screen for 3 seconds before his brain caught up with what his eyes were seeing. Then he started hitting buttons. He sent an alert to the station commander. He sent a second alert to the regional patrol fleet. He tried to send a third alert to the Vreth High Command on Kathrak. He managed to send the first 2. The third one never arrived because Harith Station stopped existing 11 seconds after his hands left the console. It was not an explosion in the way most people imagine explosions. Not a bright flash and a slow expanding cloud of debris. It was more like the station was simply removed. One moment it was there. The next moment the space where it had been was empty, and the stars behind it were visible again, unobstructed. 16 other border outposts experienced the same thing in the same 60-second window. The Quietus had calculated that simultaneous removal of all border communication relays in the first 60 seconds would give the Vreth military approximately 4 minutes less warning than a sequential strike would. 4 minutes in the mathematics of the quietus was significant. 4 minutes was the difference between a Vreth patrol fleet having time to form a defensive line and not having time to do anything at all except turn their ships around and realize, too late, that there was nowhere to go. Admiral Kane sat in the command center of her flagship and watched the operation reports come in on her screen. She did not stand up. She did not raise her voice. She drank tea from a plain metal cup and read each report as it arrived and said almost nothing. When she did speak, it was quietly to her bridge officers, in the tone of someone going through a checklist. She had been awake for 22 hours. She looked like she could have been awake for 5. That was the thing about Kane. She became more still as things became more serious, not less. Officers had learned to read her by the quality of her stillness. Right now, her stillness was absolute, and every person on that bridge understood what that meant. The Vreth Regional Patrol Fleet received the alert from Harith Station and scrambled. They were not a small force, 40 warships well-armed with experienced crews. Their commander, a veteran officer named Dresk, ordered them into a defensive formation and pushed them toward the border at full speed. He was trying to reach the coordinates of the first alert. He was trying to understand what he was dealing with. He found out when his forward scouts encountered the edge of the human fleet. Dresk had been in combat many times. He had fought the Mendari. He had fought pirate coalitions in the outer reaches of Vreth space. He was not easily frightened. But when his scouts' readings came back and he saw what was in front of him, not 40 ships, not 100 ships, thousands, moving in a formation so precise and coordinated that it looked less like a fleet and more like a single organism, he felt something he had not felt in many years. He felt it very briefly, because his fleet lasted 9 minutes. Quietus did not fight the way other commanders fought. It did not have ego. It did not take risks for the sake of glory, or avoid certain tactics because they seemed unsportsmanlike. It simply identified the fastest path from the current situation to the desired outcome and followed it without deviation. The desired outcome here was the complete removal of Vreth military capacity. Not the defeat of this patrol fleet specifically, but the removal of every military asset in Vreth space in the most efficient sequence possible. Dresk's fleet was removed in 9 minutes, because that was how long it took, not because any human commander felt anger toward it. His ships were simply obstacles between the current position and the next target, and they were handled accordingly. After the patrol fleet was gone, the human armada moved deeper into Vreth space. On the Vreth homeworld of Kathrak, the High Command received fragmented reports over the next several hours. The reports were fragmented because the communication network was being taken apart methodically. Not all at once, which would have been faster, but in a sequence that the Quietus had calculated would create maximum confusion in the Vreth command structure, while still allowing enough information through that the Vreth leadership would understand, clearly and completely, exactly what was happening to them. It was important, in the plan that they understood, that was deliberate. Admiral Voreth received word on his command ship 3 hours after the border was crossed. He was eating breakfast. The officer who brought the report was visibly shaken, which was unusual enough that Voreth put down his food and read the report himself, rather than waiting for a summary. He read it twice, then he read it a third time, because the numbers in it did not match anything in his understanding of human military capacity. 4,000 ships, weapons systems his intelligence officers had no classification for. 17 border installations removed in under a minute. His regional patrol fleet gone in 9 minutes with no survivors recovered. He sat with the report in his hands and he felt, first time in his long career, the specific cold feeling of a being who has made a very serious mistake and is only now understanding the full size of it. He ordered his fleet to move. He ordered every available Vreth warship in the surrounding systems to converge on the human armada's projected path. He sent urgent transmissions to the High Command, requesting full military mobilization. He did everything a competent commander would do when facing a sudden and overwhelming threat. None of it made much difference. The Vreth military, in total, was not small. They had hundreds of warships spread across their territory. Under normal circumstances, a full mobilization would have produced a formidable defensive force. But the Quietus had anticipated this. The sequence of strikes had been planned specifically to prevent mobilization, hitting shipyards before ships could launch, cutting communication lines before orders could be relayed, removing fuel depots before fleets could refuel for long engagements. The Vreth military did not collapse all at once. It collapsed piece by piece, each piece isolated from the others by the time it fell. On the seventh day, Vorath attempted to surrender. He sent a broadcast on the Open Galactic Channel, the same channel he had used to announce the massacre of Kalos IV, and he declared, formally and with all appropriate military language, that he was offering the unconditional surrender of his fleet and requesting the cessation of hostilities. The broadcast was received. No reply came. His ships stopped fighting anyway. He ordered them to hold position and waited. The human fleet continued its operation without any change in pace or direction, moved to the next set of targets on its list, and addressed them in order. Vorath sent a second broadcast, then a third. He tried private channels. He tried neutral party relays through Vale Point. He contacted Ambassador Tail of the Quarry Collective directly and begged him to intercede, carry a message, to get someone from Earth to respond. Tail tried. He sent message after message to the human diplomatic channel. 4 days he heard nothing. Then, on the 5th day of his attempts, a reply arrived. It was short, it said. The civilian population of the Vreth Dominion is not being harmed and will not be harmed. We are not at war with the Vreth people. We are at war with those who killed ours. This will end when they are gone. Tail read the message and understood immediately what it meant. He sent it to Vorath without comment. On the 11th day, the last major Vreth military installation was destroyed. The Vreth Dominion's ability to project military force anywhere in the galaxy was functionally gone, not weakened gone. What remained was the hunt. Mira's recorder had captured more than just sound. The comm recorder her father had given her, the one she had borrowed for a class presentation and never returned, had been a high-quality device, and when the explosions began, it had automatically activated its emergency documentation mode, which recorded not just audio, but all available sensor data from its immediate environment. In the chaos of the attack, while Mira ran through corridors and tunnels, the recorder had picked up fragments of Vreth military transmissions, partial signals, broken communications between the ships in orbit and the ground troops below. The Quietus had spent 3 months reconstructing those fragments. It had identified, from the voice patterns and command codes in the transmissions, the specific officers who had given specific orders during the massacre. Not just Vorath, he was already known, but the ones below him. The ones who had commanded the ground troops. The ones who had given the order to check the ruins for survivors, and ensure there were none. The ones who had, in calm professional voices, reported completion of their assignments. There were 31 of them. They had scattered when the campaign began. They were not stupid. They knew or suspected that something other than normal military targeting was happening. They ran in different directions, to different systems, using civilian transports and false identities, and the favors of allies who did not know or did not ask what they were hiding from. Quietus found them anyway. It found them one by one over the following weeks, the way a patient and very thorough investigator finds people who do not want to be found. By following the small things they could not help leaving behind. Vorath himself did not run. He stayed on his command ship with a skeleton crew and waited, because there was nowhere to go that would make a difference, and he understood that well enough by now. When the human vessel came alongside his ship, he was sitting in his command chair in his empty bridge, and he was very tired. A shuttle docked. A small team of humans came aboard in plain gray uniforms with no markings. They did not say much. They took Vorath into custody without violence, without ceremony, and brought him onto their shuttle. As they pulled away from his ship, he looked out the small viewport and saw his command vessel begin to come apart behind them, slowly and completely, till there was nothing left where it had been. He asked quietly where they were taking him. The human sitting across from him looked at him for a moment, then, she said, home. Vorath was returned to Cathrak on a Tuesday. Nobody had asked him what day it was, or whether Tuesday meant anything to him. It did not. The Vreth did not measure time in Tuesdays. The humans who planned his return had scheduled it for a Tuesday, because it was the most ordinary day of the human week. Not the beginning, not the end, just a plain day in the middle. And there was something in that choice that felt, to the people who made it, like the right kind of statement. This is not a ceremony, the choice of Tuesday said. This is not a triumph we are celebrating. This is simply a thing we are finishing. He was delivered to the edge of Vreth space in an unmarked shuttle with enough fuel to reach Cathrak. Single working communication unit. There were no guards on the shuttle with him. There were no restraints. The humans who had held him for the past 3 weeks had not mistreated him in any way. They had given him food and a room, and had spoken to him when he spoke to them, briefly and without hostility, and otherwise had left him alone with his thoughts. His thoughts had not been good company. The shuttle docked at Cathrak's main orbital station without ceremony. No one had been told he was coming. He walked off the shuttle into the station's arrivals bay and stood there for a moment, a tall reptilian being in a plain gray jumpsuit that was not his uniform. His uniform was gone, along with his rank, his fleet, and everything that had defined the last 40 years of his life. And the station workers who happened to be passing through the arrivals bay stopped and stared at him and did not know what to say. He did not know what to say either, so he said nothing. He walked to the transit desk and asked for a passage down to the surface. The news that he had returned spread faster than the shuttle that carried him down. By the time he set foot on Vreth soil, the story was already everywhere. Not just on Cathrak, across every Vreth world that still had a functioning communication network, which was not all of them. People knew who he was. People knew what had happened. They had known for weeks, because the human campaign had been visible and deliberate, and the Quietus had made no effort to hide what it was doing or why. Every Vreth citizen with a receiver had watched, helplessly, as their military was taken apart installation by installation, fleet by fleet, in a campaign so precise and so relentless that it had felt less like a war and more like a correction being applied by something that did not get tired and did not get angry and did not stop. And they had seen clearly that their homes had not been touched, their cities stood, their hospitals functioned, their food supply had not been disrupted. The humans had moved through Vreth space like a scalpel, cutting out only what they had come to cut out and leaving everything else exactly as they had found it. That was the thing the Vreth people could not stop talking about. That was the thing that kept people up at night, not with fear anymore, but with something more complicated and harder to name. The humans had the power to do so much more than they had done. They had demonstrated that power completely and without question. They had chosen to stop exactly where they had said they would stop. That choice meant something. It meant something that the Vreth High Command, who had told people for years that humanity was a primitive and reckless species barely worth considering, could not explain away. The Vreth government collapsed within 6 weeks of Voreth's return. Not because the humans demanded it. Not because of any political pressure from outside. It collapsed because the Vreth people, who had been told one thing and shown another, stopped believing in the people who had told them. Leaders who had approved the Kalos IV massacre as a demonstration of strength now faced citizens, understood very clearly what that demonstration had actually demonstrated. It had demonstrated very poor judgment. It had demonstrated a fundamental failure to understand what humanity was, and it had brought down upon the Vreth Dominion a consequence so swift and total that the only honest response was to look at the people who had made that decision and ask them to leave. Voreth lived quietly after that. He was not imprisoned. He was not put on trial by any Vreth authority. The new government that formed had enough problems without conducting a public tribunal that would keep the worst months of their history on the front page indefinitely. He moved to a small settlement on the outer edge of Cathrak's second continent, and was, by all accounts, left largely alone. People recognized him sometimes. Most of them walked past without speaking. Few said things he deserved to hear. He listened to all of it without arguing, because he had spent a great deal of time on a human ship with nothing to do but think. And whatever he had concluded during that time, he kept it to himself. Across the galaxy, things shifted. They shifted quietly at first, the way large things often do. Not with announcements, but with small changes in behavior that added up over time to something significant. Species that had maintained a careful diplomatic distance from humanity suddenly found reasons to reach out. Trade agreements that had stalled for years were reopened. Neutral stations that had historically been cool toward human representatives became noticeably warmer. The Salari hegemony, which had refused to seat human ambassadors at the main diplomatic table for 30 years on the grounds that humanity was too young a species for full representation, sent a formal letter to Earth's diplomatic office offering a permanent chair in the main chamber. The letter was cordial and made no reference to recent events, which everyone understood to be a form of grace. Ambassador Tail submitted his official report to the Quarry Collective's Grand Council 8 weeks after the last human warship turned back towards Sol. The report was thorough and detailed and covered every aspect of the crisis, from the first broadcast to the final recovery operation. The Grand Council read it. Then, several members of the Council requested that the concluding section of the report be distributed more widely to other member civilizations as what one council member called a necessary piece of education. Tail's conclusion was 3 paragraphs long. It was read the following year by more beings across more worlds than almost any diplomatic document in the history of the Quarry Collective. Parts of it were translated into 47 languages. It was taught in political science courses on worlds that had no direct connection to humanity at all. A version of it was eventually carved into the wall of the main chamber at Vale Point, below the great window that looked out at the stars, where every diplomat who entered that room would see it. It said, in the plain and careful language Tail always used when he wanted to be absolutely sure he was understood. Do not measure humanity by their anger. They are rarely angry when they are most dangerous. Measure them instead by their silence. When humans stop speaking, it means they have already decided. They do not threaten, they do not posture. They simply decide and then they act, and they do not stop until the thing they decided upon is finished. I have spent 30 years among the species of this galaxy. I have never encountered a civilization so capable of both extraordinary compassion and absolute, patient, unstoppable force. Honor their dead. Treat them as equals. And understand completely that there is no version of the calculation where provoking them ends well for the one who provokes. Report concluded with a line that Tail said he had borrowed, with permission, from the human ambassador on Vale Point, who had finally agreed to meet with him for coffee 2 weeks after the campaign ended. He had asked her what she wanted the galaxy to take away from all of this. She had thought about it for a moment, looking into her cup, and then she had said something that he wrote down immediately on the small notepad he always carried. She had said, "Didn't go silent because we were broken. We went silent because every name deserved that much from us. When you have 80,000 reasons, you don't rush." Onkelos' offer rebuilding began slowly. The planet was not abandoned. That had been discussed. There were people who felt the ground there was too soaked in grief to build on again. But the survivors had been consulted, and the survivors, almost without exception, had said they wanted to go back. It was their home. The orange sky was their sky. The iron dust was their dust. They were not going to let it become only a place where something terrible had happened. They were going to make it a place where something else happened too. Something that lasted longer. The first structure completed was not a house or a power station or a communications tower. It was a wall, a long, low wall of pale stone, built by hand over several months by the survivors and the volunteers, who came from other colonies and from Earth to help them. Into that wall, one by one, the names were carved, all 80,114 of them. It took a long time. People worked on it in the mornings, before the heat came up, and in the evenings, when the orange sky cooled to something closer to red. Children who had been born since the massacre came and helped carry stone. Because their parents had told them why it mattered, and they understood, even very young, that some things you do not let other people do for you. Mira Osi came back for the dedication. She was 14 now, taller, quieter than she had been before, in the way that people who have survived something tend to be. She stood in front of the finished wall on the morning of the ceremony and looked at the names until she found the ones she was looking for, the ones she had known. She stood there for a long time. No one hurried her. At the base of the wall, below all the names, there was a single line of text. It had been her idea. She had written it on a piece of paper and given it to the people building the wall, and they had not changed a single word of it. It said, "We did not go silent because we were broken. We went silent because we were listening to every name." The orange sky was very clear that morning. The iron dust caught the light and made the air glow, the way it always had, the way it would again for as long as people chose to live there and love it. Which, it turned out, was going to be a very long time. Somewhere very far away, in a cold facility below the surface of Titan, Admiral Yusra Kane sat at her desk and read the final operational report for Stillwater. She read every page. When she finished, she signed it, closed it, and set it aside. Then she picked up a plain metal cup of tea and sat for a while in the quiet, and did not say anything at all. She did not need to. It was finished.